Marcus Bull Davidson, Hells Angels, 58 years old, the last man in Penny's Harvest Diner anyone would ask for help, thought it was just a worn Bible tucked inside an old woman's cardigan. Until she slid it across the table, and he opened the front cover and read 3 words in shaky ballpoint ink. Nathan. Spring. Money. 4:17 p.m., a Tuesday in February. The woman across from him weighed maybe 95 pounds. Her left wrist sat at an angle no wrist should sit. And in the next 60 seconds, she was going to tell a Hells Angel something that would make every other Tuesday of his life feel like practice for this one. Because if this 79-year-old woman had spent 23 months being turned away, by neighbors, by doctors, by the police, by a pastor who said, "This isn't really the place, dear," and went back to his cobbler. She had approximately 95 minutes before her son came home from work and noticed she was gone. That's when the locks would change. That's when the flip phone would disappear for repairs again. That's when Dorothy Mae Callahan might simply stop being findable. All she had was a Bible, a wedding ring still on her finger, and 7 words she'd spent 2 years working up the courage to say to a stranger in a Hells Angels vest. That's where this story begins. And that's not where it ends. If what you just heard already has you leaning forward, stay with me. Subscribe to Valiant Bikers, drop your city in the comments below, and don't go anywhere, because this story is only getting started. "Sir, can you call someone for me?" That's what she said. 7 words. She didn't ask to be saved. She didn't ask for money or a ride or for anyone to believe her. She asked for a phone call. That was all. 79 years old, and she had spent 23 months shrinking her need down until it fit inside 7 words, because she had learned, through trial and through consequence, that anything larger than that got reframed, got dismissed, got folded up and handed back to the man who'd taken everything else. Dorothy Mae Callahan had walked into Penny's Harvest Diner at 4:09 p.m. She had walked, not driven, because Nathan had sold her car 14 months ago. For her safety, he said. The 1987 Ford Taurus had been gone from the driveway within 6 days of the power of attorney being signed, an event Dorothy still couldn't fully explain to herself, because she had been on pain medication for a fractured wrist, and she had trusted him because he was her son, because you don't stop trusting your son just because he starts making decisions a little too quickly. The walk from 23 Birchwood Commons drive to this diner was 2.4 miles. She had left at 3:31 p.m. She knew Nathan's Tuesday schedule. Office until 6:15, then Rotary at 7. She had a window. Not a large one, but a window. The pale blue cardigan she wore was missing 2 buttons, safety-pinned closed at the chest. Her orthopedic shoes were cracked at the toe box, resoled with electrical tape. She had dressed carefully. Still had pride, the kind of pride that gets you through a 2.4-mile walk in 34-degree weather without letting it show on your face. When she reached the diner door, she stood outside for 47 seconds. Darla noticed her through the window. Darla Sims, 63, had worked the afternoon shift at Penny's Harvest for going on 19 years. She'd seen the full spectrum of Missouri humanity walk through that door, traveling salesmen and grieving widows and teenagers trying to look older and old men trying to feel younger. She was not a person given to alarm. But something about the way this woman stood outside the door, hands clasped in front of her stomach, fingers folded inward, head making small tilts left and right like she was listening for something before she moved. Made the hair on Darla's arms rise slightly. She watched the woman come inside. She watched her stop at the first table. 2 women in real estate jackets, laptops open. And she watched one of those women say something before the old woman had even opened her mouth. She watched Dorothy move to the second table. The young couple sharing earbuds. Watched the man smile, glance at Dorothy's trembling hands, look back at his phone. Watched Dorothy move again. The man eating alone with a briefcase angled his entire body toward the window. Didn't say a word, just closed. Then Darla saw her stop at the table with the church lanyards. She knew those men. Pastor Whitfield, First Methodist, 2 deacons from his congregation. Good community luncheon crowd. She'd refilled their coffee twice. She watched Pastor Whitfield notice something on Dorothy's arm. Darla couldn't see what from where she stood, and then she heard him, loud enough to carry 3 tables. "Ma'am, there are services for situations like yours. You should call 211. We do outreach on Wednesdays, dear. This isn't really the place." And then he turned back to his peach cobbler. Darla set down the coffee pot she was holding, because in the corner booth, the only person left in this diner who hadn't been asked, Marcus Davidson had looked up from his newspaper. Bull Davidson was 58 years old, 6'2", gray-bearded, with 4 arms that could have belonged to a man 20 years younger, and eyes that had not, in all those years, stopped being watchful. He was wearing his cut, the Hells Angels vest he'd worn for 3 decades, weathered enough now that the leather moved with him like a second skin. There was a scar along his right knuckle from a night that was somebody else's story. He had a half-eaten bowl of stew, a folded newspaper, and a second cup of coffee that Darla had brought without being asked, because she always did, because he was a Tuesday regular the same way weather was regular. People in Penny's Harvest chose different seats when Bull was in the corner booth. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to find out, was that Bull had been coming to this specific diner, this specific booth, every Tuesday for 11 years, because this was where he and his wife, Margaret, had always stopped on their road trips. Margaret had been gone for 6 years. He still stopped. He had been watching Dorothy since the second rejection. He hadn't moved, hadn't stood. He read people through stillness, not through motion. That was a thing you learned if you lived long enough and paid attention. And what he was reading in this woman, in the careful way she moved, in the hands clasped just so once, in the way her eyes went to the door every few minutes, like she was calculating something. He understood that this was not an old woman who was confused. This was an old woman who was running. He pulled out the chair across from him with 1 boot before she reached the table. He didn't stand, didn't want to loom. Just moved the chair, kept both hands visible on the table, leaned back slightly to create space instead of pressure. Made eye contact once, long enough to say "I see you," then broke it, because some people need to be seen, and then given room to decide what to do with that. Dorothy stopped at the table's edge. She looked at him for a long moment. The vest, the tattoos, the gray beard. She looked at the chair he'd just moved out for her. And then she said, "Sir, can you call someone for me?" Bull said, "Sit down first. Then we'll call." She sat. Her hands went immediately to her lap, and Bull saw her holding something. A small black Bible, worn at the spine, gold letters embossed on the cover. Dorothy Mae Callahan. She held it the way people hold things that are the last thing they have left. She smoothed her cardigan with both palms. Once, twice. A gesture worn smooth from repetition, like a habit formed over months of needing to self-soothe in small, invisible ways. "I don't have a phone," she said. Her voice was soft, each word chosen carefully, the way you choose words when you've learned they can be used against you. "My son. He manages my phone. I just need to call my husband's sister. She doesn't know where I am. Her name is Evelyn Marsh. She's in the book." Bull said, "I'll find her." "I walked here," Dorothy said, like she was confessing something. "From Birchwood Commons. I know that's far. I left while Nathan was at his office." A pause. "I have until 6:15 before he notices." 92 minutes. Bull did not look at his watch. He looked at Dorothy's left wrist resting on the table, sitting at an angle that no wrist should sit. "Your wrist?" he said. "When did that happen?" 23 months ago. Kitchen tile. I fell." She looked down at it, the way people look at things they've stopped expecting to be fixed. "He said it didn't need a second opinion." And that was layer 1. The surface. The visible damage. Layer 2 came 90 seconds later, when Dorothy took a slow breath and said, "My medication. For my diabetes. He gives it to me when he decides I need it. The refrigerator, the left side where the fresh food is, there's a padlock. I have access to the right side. Protein drinks and bread. That's mostly what I eat." The country radio played low. The coffee burner hissed. 3 booths away, a man laughed at something on his phone. Bull's hand stayed flat on the table. Still. Deliberate. "How long?" he said. Not a question. Just 2 words to keep her going. "He moved into my house 14 months ago, to provide care. That's what he said." She smoothed the cardigan again. "My bedroom, the master, he converted it into my recovery room. Twin mattress now. He keeps it at 61 degrees at night. He said it's better for sleep." She almost smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "My room locks from the outside. For my safety. That's what the hook and eye is for." Darla was pretending to wipe down the counter 4 booths away. She wasn't wiping anything. Layer 3. "I called the police," Dorothy said. 8 months ago. From the pharmacy. The officer came to the house. Nathan showed him the kitchen, offered him coffee. Nathan is very good at kitchens. The officer left a pamphlet. She unclasped her hands and slid the Bible across the table. Bull looked at her. She nodded once. He opened the front cover. 3 words. Shaky ballpoint, written with the careful pressure of someone who'd thought about each letter before committing it to paper. Nathan. Spring. Money. 17 days ago, Dorothy said. Thursday night. I couldn't sleep. I went to get water, and I heard him on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice had dropped to something barely above the low hum of the radio. He said the timeline was working out. He said the word declining. And then he said a number. The house, my house, it's almost 500,000. Free and clear since 1991. And there's a life insurance policy my husband Raymond took out in 1988. Nathan changed the beneficiary 19 months ago. She folded her hands back over the Bible. He said, by spring, to whoever was on the phone. He said comfortably by spring. He said... She stopped. Restarted. He said, who's going to ask? She doesn't talk to anyone I haven't talked to first. The diner hummed around them. Ordinary. Warm. Smelling of bacon grease and old wood and the faint chemical lemon of industrial cleaner. The kind of Tuesday afternoon that looks, from the outside, like nothing is happening. "I think he did the same thing to my Raymond," Dorothy said. "Raymond died 3 years ago. Heart failure," the certificate said. Nathan was his medical proxy by the end. There was a policy on Raymond, too. It paid out $180,000. Nathan had the beneficiary changed 14 weeks before Raymond died. She looked at Bull directly. Sharp, intelligent eyes. The kind of eyes that remember everything and are terrified no one will believe them. "I don't want to die in my own house and have it look like I just got old," she said. "That's all. That's the whole of it. I just don't want that." Bull was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "You're not going back there tonight." Dorothy blinked. "I don't need to know the rest of it yet," he said. "You had the guts to walk 2.4 miles in February and ask a stranger for help. That's enough. Now I'm going to step outside for 1 minute. When I come back in, we're going to find Evelyn Marsh, and then we're going to do this the right way." He slid his phone across the table, face up, unlocked. He pointed to the contacts screen. "You're in charge of this call," he said. "I'll be right outside the door." He stood. And Dorothy Mae Callahan, for the first time in 23 months, was sitting somewhere making a decision that nobody else had approved first. The cold outside Penny's Harvest hit Bull at 34 degrees and felt like clarity. He had been in 3 situations in his life that required him to think fast and move slow. This was one of them. He pulled out a second phone, the brick, the one the club used, and he dialed. 2 rings. "Stone." "It's Bull. I need every brother within 60 miles at Penny's Harvest, Highway 61 Service Road outside Marshfield, now." A pause. Not long. The weight of the word now settling in. "What's going on?" "Elderly woman, 79. Her son's had POA for 23 months and he's been running the full playbook, locked fridge, controlled medication, the house in his name, an insurance policy he changed the beneficiary on 19 months ago. And she heard him on the phone 17 days ago saying, 'By spring.'" Bull turned toward the diner window. Through the glass, he could see Dorothy sitting very still, the phone pressed to her ear with both hands. "There may be a previous victim. Her husband, 3 years ago. We're not waiting for the system to find a Tuesday slot for this one." The line was quiet for 1 second. "Say no more. We're coming." The call ended. No debate. No questions about proof, about jurisdiction, about whether this was their business. Just the sound of a man already in motion, and then silence. That was what Brotherhood meant. Inside the diner, Darla watched the old woman on the phone begin to cry. Not loud, not dramatic. The kind of crying that happens when you've been holding something for 2 years and someone finally says, "I'll find her." And they actually do. She didn't know what was happening. Not exactly. But she knew enough. She walked over to Dorothy's table, refilled the coffee cup Dorothy hadn't touched, and put a hand on her shoulder for exactly 3 seconds. The precise amount of warmth a stranger can offer without overstepping. Dorothy reached up and touched Darla's hand without looking up from the phone. 22 minutes later, the first motorcycles turned off Highway 61. Dean Stone Mercer had made 4 calls from his truck before he'd even started the engine. The Springfield chapter. The Jefferson City chapter. A retired county investigator named Mason, who owed Stone 2 favors, and had, as of last week, a case file with the words Larkspur Motor Lodge appearing on page 4. Because the thing about a town the size of Marshfield is that threads don't stay separate for long. And the thread Bull had just picked up in a diner booth was connected to something Mason had been pulling since December. Stone himself was 61 years old, built like a man who'd stopped caring what he looked like 30 years ago, and never looked back. He had a jaw like a door hinge, and a voice that carried the kind of weight that made people instinctively lower their own. He had spent 20 years making law enforcement come to the club instead of chasing it. He would do it again tonight. He walked into Penny's Harvest at 5:02 p.m., looked at Bull, looked at Dorothy, and sat down. "Tell me everything," he said to her. "Take your time. We've got it." Dorothy looked at this man, gray-haired, heavy-shouldered, leather vest, crow's feet cut deep from decades of squinting into wind, and she did something she hadn't done in 23 months. She started at the beginning. By 5:15, 5 specific men had arrived and taken positions around the diner with the quiet, unannounced coordination of people who'd done this kind of thing before. Not this exact thing, but this kind of thing. The kind where someone needed to not be alone while information moved. Mason, 54, former county investigator, 22 years with the department before he'd hung his badge on a nail and gone looking for something that felt less like paperwork, sat in the booth directly behind Dorothy, a cup of black coffee in front of him, his phone face down, a legal pad open. He was listening in the way investigators listen, with his whole body, moving nothing. Doc, 61, retired ER physician, who had spent 3 decades treating the consequences of what people did to each other, and then one morning decided he needed to ride instead. Introduced himself softly to Dorothy, and asked if he might look at her wrist. She let him. He held it in both hands for 15 seconds. He set it down gently. He didn't say anything yet, but something in his expression went very quiet in a way that said everything. Shepard, 49, former family services caseworker, 17 years of it before the system burned him clean through, sat across from Mason and began making a list. He knew this architecture. He had seen it constructed, piece by piece, in living rooms and medical offices and courthouses across 3 counties. He knew what each piece was called, which statute it violated, and what documentation you needed to dismantle it. He had left the system. The system had not left him. Relay, 31, youngest in the room by a decade, who could do things with a phone and a laptop that the older brothers had learned not to ask too many questions about, had set up in the far corner with a power strip and 2 devices. His job tonight was simple. Nothing disappears. Not a document, not a statement, not a voicemail, not a text. Whatever existed about Nathan Callahan's last 23 months was going to be found, copied, and preserved before morning. And Deacon, 71 years old, longest-serving member of the chapter, son of a Korean War-era Army family, a man who had outlasted 6 presidents and said fewer words per year than most people said per day, had heard the words locked from the outside at night, and had not spoken for a full minute afterward. When he finally did, he said 4 words to nobody in particular. "Not on my watch." Dorothy was in the middle of explaining Nathan's daily log, the notebook on the kitchen counter, the one he kept to document her confusion for any visiting authority, when Mason leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Callahan, I want you to keep talking, but I need to ask you one thing first." She looked at him. "Your husband's sister, Evelyn Marsh." You said she's been trying to reach you for 20 months. Do you know if she kept any of Raymond's original paperwork? Insurance documents, financial statements, anything from before Nathan became proxy? Dorothy went still. Evelyn kept everything, she said. Raymond always said she was the organized one. She has a filing cabinet in her spare room. He called it her fortress. Mason wrote 2 words on his legal pad and turned it so Stone could see. Previous victim. Stone read it. Nodded once. What Dorothy didn't know yet, what she couldn't know because she'd been isolated from the news of her own town for nearly 2 years, was that Mason had been working a case since December that kept returning to a motel on the east side of Marshfield called the Larkspur Motor Lodge. A different case. A different victim. But the same motel, the same pattern of staged domesticity, the same sequence of paperwork filed quietly over months before anything exploded. And now it was appearing twice in 1 week. That was when the room changed. Not loudly, not with drama, just a shift, the way a room shifts when everyone in it arrives at the same conclusion within a second of each other. And nobody has to say it. Because the name she said next, Nathan Callahan, was a name Mason had heard exactly once before, in a different context, from a different source, 2 months ago. He picked up his phone. "I need to make 1 call," he said to Stone. Stone nodded. Outside, the first formation of motorcycles was pulling into the overflow lot across the street. Engines dying one by one, the silence after all that sound settling over Highway 61 like something waiting to be used. Dorothy watched them through the window. 30 bikes, then more. The chrome catching the last thin light of a February afternoon. Riders climbing off in the unhurried way of men who have arrived exactly when they meant to arrive. She was still holding her Bible. "They're all here for me?" she said. Bull was standing beside her now. He said, "They're all here for you." Dorothy Mae Callahan, who had spent 2 years learning to take up less space, looked at the parking lot and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Raymond would have loved this. Now, here is what you might be picturing. 200 Hells Angels rolling up to a quiet Missouri neighborhood, engines screaming, neighbors running inside, curtains flying. Chaos. Fury. The kind of thing that ends with someone bleeding in a driveway and a news van arriving 20 minutes too late to catch the whole story. That is not what happened. What happened was more deliberate, more patient, and if you understand anything about men who've spent decades operating in spaces where one wrong move poisons everything, far more frightening to the man they were coming for. Because Nathan Callahan was not afraid of a scene. He was practiced at scenes. He had a story for every scene. What Nathan Callahan could not survive was evidence. And evidence takes time. Evidence takes strategy. Evidence takes the kind of quiet, methodical work that looks, from the outside, like nothing much is happening, which is exactly what they gave him. At 5:48 p.m., 23 minutes before Nathan's estimated arrival at 23 Birchwood Commons Drive, the operation was already running on 3 parallel tracks. Track 1. Mason, in the parking lot of Penny's Harvest, on the phone with a contact at Missouri Adult Protective Services. Not a tip line, not a 211 referral, but a specific caseworker named Helen Briggs, 47, who Mason had worked alongside during a 2009 elder abuse prosecution that had sent a man to prison for 6 years. Helen answered on the second ring. She had, as of 30 seconds later, opened a priority intake file, and contacted a supervisory investigator to accompany a law enforcement welfare check. Not a pamphlet. An investigator. Tonight. Track 2. Relay, still in the corner booth, had located Evelyn Marsh's address in 4 minutes using public records, confirmed her landline was active, and patched Bull through to a call that had lasted 11 minutes and ended with Evelyn Marsh saying, in a voice that shook with 2 years of accumulated grief, "I have the original policy documents, Raymond's and the other one. I have everything. I kept everything because I knew, and nobody would listen." Relay had begun photographing the documents as Evelyn held them up to her phone's camera, page by page. Track 3. Shepard had spent 40 minutes with Dorothy, not interviewing her. Interviewing implies adversarial distance, but sitting across from her at a corner table with 2 cups of tea, asking her to walk him through the last 23 months in order, from the kitchen fall to the moment she put on her cardigan this afternoon. He wrote nothing down while she talked, just listened. His hands flat on the table, his face still in the particular way of someone who has heard 100 versions of this story and never stopped being angry about any of them. When Dorothy finished, Shepard asked one question. "The notebook on the kitchen counter. Nathan's daily log. Do you know if he's ever shown that to anyone?" "The police officer," Dorothy said. 8 months ago. He showed him the notebook. The officer said it was very thorough." Shepard nodded slowly. "He's been building his documentation for 18 months. That notebook is designed to establish a record of cognitive decline before a legal challenge." Dorothy looked at him. "You know what this is?" "I've seen it before," Shepard said. "Different names, same architecture. There's a term for it. Undue influence combined with financial exploitation. What you're describing isn't a son making bad choices. It's a structured plan. And the fact that he's kept a log means he anticipated scrutiny." A pause. "That's actually useful to us, because it means there's a paper trail, and paper trails run in both directions." What Dorothy didn't know yet was that the paper trail ran further back than she thought. Doc was the one who found it. At 6:02 p.m., Relay had pulled Nathan Callahan's LLC filings, his Rotary Club financial records, and, through a contact at the county courthouse that Mason wouldn't explain and nobody asked about, a partial record of estate proceedings following Raymond Callahan's death in 2021. Doc was reading over Relay's shoulder when he said, "Pull the attending physician for Raymond. Last name and facility." Relay typed. Doc stared at the screen for 5 seconds without speaking. Then, "I know that doctor, Robert Chavez. He was still practicing at Mercy Springfield when I left. He's—" a pause that carried more than the pause itself. "He's been on the Missouri Medical Board's informal monitoring list since 2022. Overprescribing, documentation irregularities. He didn't lose his license, but he came very close." Mason had walked over by this point. He leaned down and looked at the screen. "Raymond Callahan's final attending physician," he said. "Who happens to be on a monitoring list," Doc said, "and whose signature appears on the death certificate for a man his cardiologist described as stable and managing well, 6 weeks earlier." "And who is," Relay said, typing something else, then turning the screen so they could see, "listed on the membership roster of—" he pointed. "Marshfield Chamber of Commerce. Same organization as Nathan Callahan." "They golf together," Mason said. It was not a question. Stone, standing behind both of them, said nothing for a moment, just looked at the screen. And then he said to Mason, "How long?" "Since at least 2018, based on the board minutes, 5 years before Raymond's death." This was the second victim. This was the pattern. Same structure as Dorothy: medical proxy, beneficiary change, isolation, then death. Except the first time, nobody had thought to look. The term life policy on Raymond had paid out $180,000. Nathan had been the named beneficiary. The change had been filed 14 weeks before Raymond Callahan died of what a cooperating physician described as complications from heart failure. Raymond had been 74 years old. He had been described as stable. He had trusted his son. Mason picked up his phone for the second time that hour, and this time he wasn't calling Helen Briggs. He was calling the detective who had jurisdiction over a case file that already had the words Larkspur Motor Lodge on page 4. "It's Mason. That thread we talked about. The Larkspur connection. I'm at Penny's Harvest on 61. I need you to tell me everything you have on Nathan Callahan, Callahan Property Group, and a Dr. Robert Chaves at Mercy Springfield." A pause on the other end. Then, "How did you get that name?" "Tonight," Mason said. "I'll explain everything tonight. How fast can you be at 23 Birchwood Commons Drive?" At 6:11 p.m., 4 minutes before Nathan Callahan's Tuesday schedule brought him home, the welfare check arrived. Not a patrol car. 2 vehicles, an APS investigator, and a plainclothes detective named Samuels, who had been waiting 2 months for a thread loose enough to pull. Nathan Callahan pulled into his own driveway at 6:14 p.m. He was humming. That is not a detail added for effect. That is what multiple neighbors reported later. He was humming something low and tuneless, the way a man hums when he's driving home from a good day and his mind is on what to make for dinner. He had a dry cleaning bag over one arm, navy trousers, a dress shirt. He was wearing his fleece pullover. His New Balance sneakers were clean. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who returned shopping carts. He saw the vehicles in the driveway. He saw the people standing on his front step, which was technically Dorothy's front step, at 23 Birchwood Commons Drive, a house he did not own but had been quietly moving paperwork toward owning. He paused for exactly 3 seconds. And then Nathan Callahan did exactly what Nathan Callahan always did when confronted by authority. He smiled. He walked toward them with his hand out, already arranging his face into the practiced expression of a son who was doing his best under difficult circumstances, already calibrating which version of Dorothy's confusion to lead with, already measuring the distance between what they knew and what he could reframe before they got any closer. He didn't make it to the front step. What he didn't know, couldn't know, because he had spent 23 months operating in a sealed environment of his own construction, was that Shepard had already walked investigators through the floor plan, that Mason had, in the previous 40 minutes, confirmed that the hook and eye lock on Dorothy's bedroom door was visible from the hallway window. That relay had documented and transmitted to Detective Samuels a photographic record of Evelyn Marsh's insurance files, including the original whole life policy on Dorothy, the beneficiary change form dated 19 months ago, notarized by Nathan's golf partner, and 14 months of bank statements showing Dorothy's Social Security direct deposit, $1,847 per month, flowing into a joint account from which Dorothy had withdrawn exactly $0. That Doc had written a formal preliminary assessment, in clinical language, of Dorothy's malnutrition markers, her unset wrist fracture, her unmanaged diabetes, and the blood pressure reading she'd taken at a pharmacy kiosk 6 weeks earlier, 161/98. The kind of numbers that, in a 79-year-old woman with uncontrolled blood sugar and a room kept at 61 degrees at night, carry a specific and documentable risk of outcome. that Mason had given Detective Samuels the name Robert Chavez. Nathan Callahan got halfway up his own driveway before Detective Samuels said his name. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with the flat, specific tone of someone who has decided that this conversation is going to be conducted on their terms. "Nathan Callahan?" Nathan stopped. The smile held. Actually, Detective, is everything all right? Is it my mother? We're going to need you to step over here, sir." That was the moment the smile stopped working. He was placed under arrest at 6:31 p.m. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no moment where Nathan attempted to talk his way out with the particular practiced warmth he had deployed against so many people so many times. He tried. Twice. The second time, Detective Samuels interrupted him mid-sentence with a list. Elder financial exploitation, first degree, Missouri Statute 570.145. Unlawful restraint, the hook and eye on the outside of Dorothy's bedroom door. Obtaining signature by undue influence, the power of attorney signed at the hospital while Dorothy was on pain medication and her son was the only person in the room. Medical neglect of a vulnerable person. Fraud, the beneficiary change, the notarization by a personal associate, the quiet title filing for a house Nathan had never legally acquired. And pending further investigation, the name Robert Chavez, the death of Raymond Callahan, the term that Shepard had used quietly in the back booth of Penny's Harvest 40 minutes earlier, and that Mason had now written formally on his legal pad and handed to Detective Samuels. Coordinated predatory scheme, potential prior homicide. Nathan Callahan's hands were cuffed behind his back in the driveway of 23 Birchwood Commons Drive at 6:31 p.m. on a Tuesday in February, exactly 16 minutes after he had pulled in, humming. He was read his rights with his face turned toward his own front door. The house he had been systematically transferring to himself for 23 months. The house worth $487,000. The house where his mother had been sleeping on a twin mattress with the window locked, and the heat turned down, and the fresh food behind a padlock. He didn't speak again after the rights were read. The dry cleaning bag was still over his arm when they walked him to the vehicle. The navy trousers. The dress shirt. One of the deputies took the dry cleaning bag from him before he got in. Across Highway 61, in the overflow lot of Penny's Harvest Diner, 200 motorcycles sat in formation. They had not moved, had not crossed the road, had not shouted or crowded or done a single thing that anyone could characterize as threatening. They were simply present. 200 men in identical cuts, standing beside their bikes in the February cold, watching the driveway of 23 Birchwood Commons Drive with the unhurried patience of people who had arrived exactly when they meant to and would leave exactly when it was finished. It was Deacon who said it. 71 years old, standing with his arms crossed and the wind off the highway moving through his gray hair, watching the vehicle pull away. He said, "That's what 200 looks like when it counts." Nobody argued. The room went quiet. Not a room, an overflow parking lot, 34 degrees, the sound of distant traffic and cooling engines. And Stone stood at the front of the formation and looked at every man who'd ridden out on a Tuesday night for a woman none of them had met. And he said one thing. "All those in favor of seeing this through to the end, just..." For a moment, nothing. Just the wind. Just the ticking of hot engines cooling. Just the faint smell of exhaust and cold leather. Every single hand went up. Not a moment's hesitation. Not a single voice from the back of that lot saying, "Let the system handle the rest." 200 men who had just watched the system arrive. Finally, necessarily, too late on its own to be enough. Raising their hands for a 79-year-old woman with a Bible in her cardigan pocket and 3 words written in shaky ballpoint ink. Justice had been served. But justice wasn't the ending. It was only the beginning. Dorothy Mae Callahan did not go back to 23 Birchwood Commons Drive that night. She never went back alone. At 7:14 p.m., with Detective Samuel's authorization and an APS investigator present, a small group entered the house. Doc, Shepard, Mason, and Darla, who had locked up the diner 40 minutes early without asking anyone's permission, and simply said, "I'm coming," in a tone that ended the conversation. They moved through the rooms carefully, documenting as they went. The padlock on the left side of the refrigerator. The hook and eye on the outside of Dorothy's bedroom door. The twin mattress where a queen had been. The thermostat in that room, set to 61 degrees, on a separate zone from the rest of the house. The notebook on the kitchen counter, Mom's daily log. 18 months of Nathan's careful handwriting building a false record of cognitive decline, now bagged as evidence. The china cabinet, locked, containing Dorothy's late husband's watch. Her jewelry, and the financial documents Nathan had wanted no one to find. Relay photographed everything. Every page, every lock, every degree on every thermostat. It took 43 minutes. Then Shepard walked back out to the APS vehicle, where Dorothy was sitting with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of coffee from Darla's thermos, and he said, "We have everything we need. You won't have to describe any of it again. We have pictures." Dorothy said, "Is Raymond's watch still there?" "It's there," Shepard said. "We'll get it to you." She nodded and looked out the window at the house she'd lived in since 1981. 42 years. The kitchen where she'd made breakfast for a husband she'd loved and a son she'd trusted. The front walk where she'd planted marigolds every spring. The window of the room that had been taken from her, that still glowed with the particular cold fluorescent light Nathan kept on a timer. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "I'd like to go somewhere warm now, if that's all right." The somewhere warm was a room at the Cloverdale Extended Stay, 8 miles from Marshfield, booked that night under Mason's name and paid for by the club. It was not a grand room. It had a bed with actual mattress depth, a thermostat that Dorothy could set herself, and a window that opened and locked from the inside. Doc drove her there personally. On the way, he told her what he'd found when he examined her wrist. The fracture healed in a malunion. That means the bones knit without proper alignment. It's not unfixable. There's a specialist at Barnes Jewish in St. Louis who does this kind of corrective work. I've already put in a call. He owes me a favor from about 15 years ago. He glanced at her in the passenger seat. "Your diabetes is manageable, Dorothy. You haven't been getting your medication reliably, which is why your numbers are where they are. We're going to fix that, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "He always said the wrist was fine," she said. "It wasn't fine," Doc said simply. "And that is not your fault for believing him." Dorothy looked out the passenger window at the dark Missouri highway unspooling ahead of them. The sleet that had been threatening all afternoon had held off. The sky was clear now, sharp and very cold, the kind of February sky that looks like something that's been cleaned. "How did you know?" she said. "About the wrist. You looked at it for 15 seconds, and you knew." "I spent 30 years in emergency rooms," Doc said. "I've seen what healed fractures look like when they've been set correctly and what they look like when they haven't. Yours looked like 23 months of someone deciding your pain wasn't worth a second opinion. He said it without heat, just as a fact. The kind of fact that lands harder without heat. Dorothy folded her hands in her lap, over the Bible, which had not left her since she walked into Penny's Harvest, and did not say anything else until they pulled into the parking lot. Then she said, "Thank you, Doc." He said, "Get some sleep. Someone will be here in the morning." Someone was there in the morning. Two of them, actually. Shepard, with a legal pad and a list of the next 30 days' appointments, and a woman named Carol Hennessy from Missouri Adult Protective Services, who had spent the previous 16 hours reviewing everything Relay had transmitted, and whose expression, when she arrived, was the specific expression of a professional who has seen too many of these cases and is not prepared to see another one end the wrong way. The appointments: Barnes Jewish, wrist consultation, 2 weeks out. Primary care physician, not the one Nathan had been taking her to, a different one. Specifically selected because she had zero professional connection to either Nathan Callahan or Dr. Robert Chaves. First appointment: Thursday. A diabetes management clinic in Springfield that offered sliding scale fees. Friday. And a meeting with a probate attorney because Dorothy's home, 23 Birchwood Commons Drive, free and clear since 1991, appraised at $487,000, was still legally hers. The quiet title filing Nathan had initiated was incomplete. It had a date on it, but no signature, which meant it was a draft, which meant it had not yet been filed, which meant Dorothy still owned her house. The POA was under challenge on grounds of undue influence, given the circumstances under which it had been signed. Carol Hennessy had flagged this to the probate attorney the previous night, and the attorney had used a word that Shepard wrote down and later showed Dorothy: voidable. The account held in Nathan's name containing Dorothy's accumulated Social Security deposits, 23 months at $1,847 per month, was frozen pending investigation. The amount in that account, which Dorothy had not touched in 14 months because she had not been permitted to, $42,481, hers. The life insurance policy, $312,000, beneficiary changed to Nathan 19 months ago, was under review by the Missouri Department of Insurance. The beneficiary change, notarized by Nathan's golf partner, was being examined for irregularities. The attorney Dorothy was meeting on Thursday had specifically mentioned the phrase fraudulent inducement. Dorothy listened to all of this while sitting in a chair by the window of the extended stay room, wearing clean clothes, a sweater that Darla had arrived with that morning, quietly, along with 2 paper bags of groceries and the information that the sweater had belonged to Darla's mother, and she'd always thought it needed someone to wear it properly. When Shepard finished reading the list, Dorothy said, "Evelyn, has anyone told Evelyn where I am?" "She knows," Shepard said. "She's driving down from Kansas City on Thursday. She said to tell you," he looked at his notepad, "she said to tell you she still has the cobbler recipe you gave her in 1987, and she never once made it right, and maybe this time you can show her in person." Dorothy put both hands over her face. Not grief, not fear. Something that had been dammed up for 23 months, finding the first opening large enough to move through. Carol Hennessy handed her a box of tissues without a word. Shepard looked out the window. 2 weeks later, Louise Haverford came forward. Louise, 68, Dorothy's neighbor, the woman who had called Nathan directly 20 months ago, when Dorothy first tried to tell someone, and watched Dorothy lose her flip phone for 2 weeks as a result. She had driven to the APS office herself, no appointment, and sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes until someone could see her. Her hands shook through the entire interview. She had seen the bruises. Not once, repeatedly, across 14 months. She had seen Dorothy's cardigan safety-pinned closed on days that weren't cold enough to need it. She had heard once, through the fence between their yards, a sound she had described to herself at the time as an argument, and later, in the APS interview, could not describe as anything except what it actually was. She had not called CPS. She had called Nathan. Because she had believed, she had wanted to believe, that Nathan was a good son doing a hard thing, and that calling the authorities would embarrass Dorothy, and that it wasn't her place, and that someone else would notice eventually. "I knew something was wrong," she said to the investigator. I didn't want to be the one who made it worse." The investigator wrote it down. Frank Delgado, the pharmacist, gave a formal statement the same week. He had flagged the lapsed diabetes prescription 4 months in. He had called Nathan. Nathan had thanked him warmly and picked up the prescription that same day. Filled it once. Did not refill. Frank had not called again, because Nathan had thanked him so warmly, and Frank had told himself that the situation was being handled, and that Nathan seemed like such a conscientious son. The doctor, not Dr. Chavez, but Dorothy's most recent primary care physician, who had noted possible mild cognitive decline in Dorothy's chart, using language Nathan had seeded, submitted a correction affidavit. He had been in the room with Nathan for every appointment. He had never examined Dorothy without Nathan present. He stated in writing that he could not distinguish between what he had actually observed and what he had been told to expect. He also stated that he should have asked Nathan to leave the room. He had not. That statement went into Dorothy's file. It also went to the Missouri Medical Board. Nathan Callahan was denied bail at his initial hearing. The prosecution had argued that a man with a pending quiet title filing on a $487,000 property, access to offshore LLC accounts, and a prior pattern of financial exploitation constituted an unacceptable flight risk. The judge agreed. Bail was set at $500,000, a number, the prosecutor noted without flourish, that a man who had stolen the equivalent of $42,000 in Social Security funds and spent $63,000 on a commercial real estate investment under a personal LLC would find difficult to meet. He had not met it as of the date this story was completed. The charges, as formally filed: elder financial exploitation, first degree, unlawful restraint, obtaining signature by undue influence, medical neglect of a vulnerable person, felony fraud, insurance beneficiary modification by deception, and pending the outcome of the investigation into Raymond Callahan's death and Dr. Robert Chavez's role in it, conspiracy to commit financial exploitation resulting in death. That last charge had not been in the original filing. Mason had put it there. The investigation into Dr. Robert Chavez and into what the Missouri AG's office was now calling, in preliminary filings, a coordinated predatory scheme targeting elderly individuals with valuable estates, was ongoing. It had begun with 3 words in shaky ballpoint ink: Nathan, spring, money. This story is not really about a diner. It's not about motorcycles or leather vests or the particular way 200 engines sound when they go quiet in unison on a cold February evening. It's about a 79-year-old woman who spent 23 months watching every door close, and who still, after all of that, put on her cardigan, safety-pinned it closed, and walked 2.4 miles in 34-degree weather to try one more time. Because she had not given up on the idea that somewhere there was someone who would hear 7 words and understand what they actually meant. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, an extraordinary thing. Here is something the headlines don't usually say. What happened to Dorothy Callahan has a name. It's called elder financial exploitation. And according to the National Council on Aging, it affects approximately 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 60. Not 1 in 100. 1 in 10. The financial losses reported each year exceed $36 billion. And those are only the cases that get reported. Researchers estimate that for every case that reaches an authority, roughly 44 do not. Dorothy's case didn't reach an authority for 23 months. Not because no one noticed. Because the people who noticed didn't know what they were looking at. That is the part worth understanding. What Nathan Callahan used was a power of attorney. Most people know that term. It means one person is authorized to make legal and financial decisions for another. It is a legitimate, necessary legal tool. Millions of families use it responsibly every single day. But in the wrong hands, a power of attorney is the master key. It transfers control of bank accounts, property, medical decisions, and legal identity all at once, all legally, to whoever holds the document. And when it is obtained under what the law calls undue influence, meaning the person signing it is in pain, or frightened, or dependent, or simply trusts the person holding the pen, it can be signed in a hospital room on a bad day and used for years afterward. Dorothy signed hers while she was on pain medication for a fractured wrist in a room where her son was the only other person present. That is not unusual. The National Center on Elder Abuse reports that in the majority of financial exploitation cases, the perpetrator is a family member, a son or daughter, occasionally a grandchild, someone the victim loves and trusted and cannot easily believe would harm them, which is precisely why the harm goes undetected for so long. There are specific things to watch for, not dramatic things, quiet ones. A parent who used to handle their own finances but suddenly can't tell you what's in their account. A sibling who is always present at doctor's appointments and always speaks first. A mother whose medication runs out before the prescription should be empty. A father who seems thinner than last time, quieter than last time, who starts sentences and stops them, who glances at the door when certain names come up. A refrigerator with a padlock, a thermostat set to 61 degrees in a room where an old woman sleeps alone. These things do not announce themselves. They accumulate. They look, from the outside, like a family managing a difficult situation the best they can. And the person inside the situation has often been so thoroughly conditioned to doubt their own perception that they describe 23 months of systematic harm as "he manages things." Dorothy described it as "he manages things." She was not confused. She was precise. She had simply learned that precision in her own home had consequences. If you suspect something, not if you're certain, not if you have proof, not if you've been through legal consultations, if you simply suspect something, there are specific steps that cost nothing and require nothing except a phone call. Every state has an Adult Protective Services hotline. In Missouri, it is 1-800-392-0210. Nationally, the Elder Care Locator, run by the U.S. Administration on Aging, can be reached at 1-800-677-1116. These are not reporting lines that send police cars to a front door. They are intake lines staffed by people trained specifically in these situations, people who know the difference between a family managing difficulty and a family member managing a victim. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to have proof. You need to make the call. Frank Delgado, the pharmacist, knew Dorothy's diabetes medication hadn't been refilled in 4 months. He called Nathan. Nathan thanked him warmly and filled the prescription once. Frank did not call APS. He called the person who was causing the problem and accepted the warmth as resolution. Louise Haverford saw the bruises. She called Nathan. Same result. Dorothy's doctor noted possible cognitive decline in her chart, the exact language Nathan had planted, and scheduled an assessment Nathan never took her to. The doctor accepted Nathan's presence in the room at every appointment as a sign of devoted care. 3 people who saw something. 3 people who called the wrong number. 1 phone call to the right number, 8 months earlier, might have changed everything. It also might not have. The system is not perfect. Dorothy herself called the non-emergency line from a pharmacy payphone, and an officer arrived, accepted a staged kitchen and a warm handshake, and left a pamphlet. That is a real failure of the system, and it deserves to be named as one. But here is what Mason said. 2 weeks after Nathan's arrest, when a reporter asked him what regular people should do if they suspected elder abuse in their neighborhood. Call APS. Call again. Call a 3rd time if you have to. Cases get opened and cases get closed, but the 3rd call from the same address in 6 months looks different than the first one. Paper trails run in both directions. Persistence is evidence. Call, and call again. 6 months after a Tuesday afternoon in February, Dorothy Mae Callahan was sitting in her own kitchen at 23 Birchwood Commons Drive, drinking coffee from her own mug. The marigolds were coming up along the front walk. She had planted them herself, with Evelyn kneeling beside her in the April dirt, both of them working slowly and without hurry, talking about Raymond the way you talk about someone you loved, when you've finally been given back the right to say his name out loud. Her wrist had been corrected at Barnes Jewish in March. Blood pressure at her most recent appointment, 118/74. She had gained 11 pounds. Her hair, at the temples, had stopped thinning. She made cobbler for Evelyn in May. Got it right on the first try. Raymond's watch was back on the mantel. The Missouri AG's Elder Exploitation Unit, using Dorothy's case as a template, had by that point opened 3 additional investigations into similar patterns across 2 counties. The documentation framework Relay had built was incorporated in modified form into their standard investigative intake procedure. 1 case. Documented carefully. Running forward into 3 more. The National Council on Aging estimates that 1 in 10 older Americans experiences some form of abuse, neglect, or exploitation each year. Of those cases, elder financial exploitation is the fastest growing, and in nearly 90% of reported cases, the person responsible is someone the victim knows, often someone the victim loves. Dorothy knew. She had known for 23 months. She had tried to tell 5 people before she walked into Penny's Harvest and sat down across from a man in a Hells Angels vest, because he was the only person left in that room she hadn't tried yet. She had not given up on being believed. That matters. If you are watching this and there is someone in your life, a parent, a neighbor, a friend from church whose calls have gotten less frequent, whose car disappeared from the driveway, who seems smaller and more careful every time you see them, pay attention to that. Pay attention to who is always in the room, to whose name makes them glance toward the door, to a medication that never seems to run low because it never gets properly dispensed, to a wrist that healed wrong because a second opinion was decided against on their behalf. You don't need a Hells Angels vest to be the person who listens. You need only the willingness to hear something uncomfortable without deciding in advance that the most convenient explanation is the true one. Dorothy tried 5 times. The first 4 times, the people who heard her chose comfort over clarity. The 5th time, a man in a corner booth moved a chair with his boot before she even asked. Notice the people around you. And when you notice something, use the number 1-800-677-1116. The Elder Care Locator. Free, national, staffed by people who know what to do with what you've seen. That call costs nothing. For Dorothy, the absence of that call cost 23 months. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Valiant Bikers and share it with someone who has an elderly person in their life. Drop your city in the comments and tell me, have you ever been the person who finally pulled out the chair? Because Dorothy's story is not the only one. There are Dorothys everywhere, and sometimes the only difference between what happened to Raymond and what didn't happen to her is one person who picked up the right phone. Notice. Call. Stay with it. Pull out the chair. 6 months later, Dorothy Mae Callahan planted marigolds. She was wearing the same pale blue cardigan. Both buttons had been replaced. Evelyn had done it in April, with buttons from a tin Raymond kept in his desk drawer for 30 years. Orange amber, the color of things that come back after winter. The safety pins were gone. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And drop your city below. Because this community is full of people who pay attention, and that matters more than you know.